So, what an interesting list of results that I got when I typed these words into Google. People are really good at dissecting the Asian parent phenomenon. So the reason why I want to do this topic today, firstly, of course, well, I am Asian. Secondly, I think the Asian parent stereotype is something that is not just familiar to all Asians, but also really across the entire world. It's something that people are familiar with and it's quite an interesting phenomenon that deserves some treatment. Thirdly, I've recently noticed that parents who are more cosmopolitan, so in terms of both life experience and value system, tend to fit less into the Asian parent stereotype. And this is regardless of whether they geographically live in an Asian country or not. This really made me kind of question whether the Asian parent stereotype is more of a result of the economic reality of Asia or cultural forces. So I guess the question of the video will be, why are Asian parents the way they are? And what I mean by the way they are roughly encompasses all the terms that have been mentioned in this list of search results.
I would like to first start with the Quora page for this question. I think the list of answers we can look at there is actually quite interesting, and let's start by reading a sample of them. Their grandparents and ancestors grew up in poverty and the threat of starvation, so they expected their kids to be strict like them. Then they raised their kids in the same way because they thought it would stop them from being irresponsible through fear and manipulation. Because Confucius, that asshole, defined parent-child relationships as very unequal and both parties have roles to fulfill, parents give life and provide at great sacrifice if necessary, the child is expected to do whatever the Asian parents want. Kind of like sentient pets with future income potential. Asian kids are future income. And this one is from an anonymous girl who is of Filipino-American descent. When I was very young, I was programmed to become this multi-instrument musician, math whiz daughter who was fed constantly on a regular basis doctor-based video games and learning books, tools that would help me out in the future. My parents are also very critical with my appearance, as they don't like me wearing too much makeup and want me to have clear and beautiful skin. As well as not being too fat or ugly or slutty, I'm told on a daily basis to fix how I look, no matter if it's the smallest or the largest thing, they will want me to fix it. I'm not allowed to be of the LGBTQ plus community. They're unsupportive but nice to my LGBT friends. And I'm not allowed to have a boyfriend, but I am allowed to have friends that are male. I have been disciplined in as many ways as possible and have been taken away of many things due to numerous and countless reasons of my misbehavior, whether it is school or my attitude. A few things that I can do is that I'm allowed to have friends over and I'm allowed to hang out with friends with their consent and knowledge. I personally relate to these contents so much. It feels like someone was peeking into my life as a teenager. My mom, for example, was very critical of my parents. Well, arguably, she kind of still is, but she sees me less since I'm in university, so that has been kind of less present in my life. And of course, I'm expected to stay away from the LGBTQ community, which I don't know how it's meant to work, to be honest, because if you are LGBTQ+, then you are. If you're not, then you're not. There's nothing your parents can change about it, and I guess the only difference is maybe they wouldn't want you to come out if you are. But again, I think my parents are the same. They're really nice to my LGBTQ friends. When I mean really nice, as in they don't like them less than my other friends. I guess most Asian parents wouldn't be straight out homophobic. They respect people's sexuality regardless, but they just don't want that off their kids, which is an interesting logic, really. And it kind of made me think whether you can sincerely respect a certain group, but still be really upset if your kid becomes part of that group. So do you really treat that group as an equal? It's that sort of interesting question.
I thought about this question whilst I was editing, and I guess the answer that I finally came up with would be yes. I think Asians in general are just very culturally ingrained with this mentality of conforming to the masses or to authority. So they wouldn't want their kids to be LGBTQ+ because this is kind of against the mainstream value system or what the authority in a lot of Asian countries think is the best. So if you think about this analogy, so there's a small group of revolutionaries in an Asian country, even if the parents themselves may think, oh, the revolutionaries are supporting a good cause, they may not want their children to join it because they know it will harm their children's long-term prospects.
And yes, the last part about being monitored on like the sorts of social relationships I have with other people is definitely a big thing in Asian households. Usually, parents don't believe that their kids are ready to make their own decisions. They often think that their children will make mistakes that will ruin their lives or cause difficulty for their future. Thus, they think that their kids need their guidance on anything and everything. That's why they try to control their children. If Asian parents have more faith in their kids, I think they will be less controlling. I also absolutely agree with this. I think Asian parents just have this morbid fear of their kids like going wrong in life. There are a few key themes to note in these answers. One idea is that Asian parents are like this because that was how they were raised. So it was like a vicious cycle. And the other idea was that, cultural reasons, Asian cultures just do not conceive of kids as independent human beings who should be treated as equals and who deserve to make their own choices. And this cultural part, why it's like that, is actually quite complex, and I will flag this discussion towards the last part of the video. Please stay to check that out, it's quite interesting. And maybe a third idea would be that Asia just tends to be more competitive places for limited opportunities. So in order for their kids to succeed in life, parents kind of have to be more strict and controlling. So now let's explore these ideas one by one. Firstly, the generational problem. I think the issue with assuming generational regress is you can only figure out how your parents or your grandparents lived like up to a certain point. After that, it's impossible to figure out how they were raised. And also, generational regress is a regress. You don't know when it's meant to stop. Like, when did the parenting style like fundamentally start? Was it your grandparents, your great-grandparents? So I think this is kind of not very explanatory in a sense, and it's just like a shortcut cheat way for people who want to give a very quick explanation of why Asian parents are the way they are. And also, it's very hard to explain why it particularly emerged in Asia. Countless other parts of the world have had earlier generations who lived in poverty, so why not the African parent or the Latino parent, Why the Asian parent? So I think on top of this idea of the scarcity of resources in earlier generations and possibly continuing into current generation, I'll discuss that later, we need one further element in the discussion, and that is one uniform conception of success. And I think this is really most popularly understood in the doctor versus lawyer dichotomy. So I think in most other cultures, you can be perceived as having a happy or successful life and well respected, and people are like, oh, you're having a great time, you're enjoying your life, you're doing what you love, it's your choice, should be respected. So in other cultures, you can do a diversity of things and still be viewed like that. But in Asia, there's a very limited scope of occupation that can give people social respect. So it may not be the case that jobs considered traditionally prestigious are just very, very scarce in Asia in particular, but just that Asian people tend to put an extraordinary focus on getting into those jobs. Firstly, career prejudice exists all over the world. But for example, if you're in a Western culture, of course you get some extra grain of admiration if you're in a job considered prestigious, but people don't tend to think you're just automatically lesser of a person if you're not in one of those jobs. But in Asia, there is a real possibility that you're considered less of a person and just a failure of a person if you're not in a prestigious job. But then the question is, why are Asians taught to have such a uniform conception of success? I think the problem is probably very much influenced by historical reasons. So speaking from my own experience of Asian countries, maybe with a focus on more on East Asia, historically they have had very big governments, and for almost all those Asian countries, the big government persisted until very recent times, and some still continue to have big governments. So these big governments are very much centered around a monarch that has absolute power, a godlike monarch who has absolute power over everything. So it's quite different from a lot of European countries that had monarchs until recent times, and in the UK, which we still do until today. The European monarch isn't that absolute. They have ways to limit their powers.
I have to make some clarifications here. So firstly, what I mean by the big all-encompassing monarch, it doesn't necessarily have to be the person of the monarch who is literally exercising the power. It can also be, in reality, an aristocratic class or a military class who is exercising power under the name of the monarch, as in the case of Japan for some period of time. Also, I need to acknowledge that I am making a very, very broad generalization here. There will definitely be a lot of countries in both Asia and Europe that do not fit into this generalization. But I don't think the outliers are numerous enough to defeat my overall point.
But in Asia, if you have like this absolute monarch, then there is potentially no theoretical limit to what aspect of life the state could control. So if you wanted to lead a life of wealth and power, your best and perhaps only choice is to become affiliated with the government. And even now, I think there is this obsession throughout some Asian countries of getting a government post. So like, for example, if you go on the dating market, especially if you're a man and you have a government post, people look up to you so much. I guess what I want to say is that Asian people have been conditioned throughout history to believe that the successful path is a very narrow path that is limited to an affiliation with this like one absolute ideal of the good or the ideal of power and wealth, and that has traditionally been the big government. And now, even though the big government has disappeared from a lot of Asian countries, I think the psychological roots still remain. Like, Asian people tend to have a higher acceptance of authority, and they're more accepting of social hierarchies, and they're more likely to worship some absolute power and like strive to be closer to that absolute power.
I'm definitely not trying to stereotype my own race by saying like, oh, Asian people are all blah blah blah, but I'm just saying that this is like a likely disposition of people who grew up in the political and cultural context exhibited by most Asian countries.
So even if in the past Asian people have typically had very narrow paths to success, what about now with, modernization and Western influences and industrialization? So why hasn't it changed? Well, I think certainly things have changed a lot. But even after this change, it still is an undeniable fact that Asia in general has a population density that is unimaginable in almost everywhere else in the world. Competition is definitely fiercer in Asia as a matter of fact. It is this practical fact that drives parents to be more demanding on their children. They want their children to succeed after all. So now there's one further interesting question we have is like, there are so many ways you can be demanding on your children. Why the big focus on grades? I think, the simple answer would be that in countries with such fierce competition for opportunities, getting a good educational background is probably your best way of boosting your chances of success. It's the most straightforward path towards respected positions. However, there is also this more interesting historical reasons why Asians are obsessed with grades. So there was this thing that started in China around like 1000 AD, and it's called the imperial examination system, or 科举. So basically, you need to pass a standardized test held like every, year or once several years by the government in order to gain a governmental post. This was probably one of the only merit-based ways of social climbing that existed in that ancient age. So probably one of the earliest forms of meritocracy in the world. The imperial examination system quickly spread throughout Asia into countries such as Japan or Vietnam. So if you were good at exams, you got into the government, and the government was where all the good jobs were. By simply being good at studying and taking exams, you can gain all the wealth, fame, and money that you could have ever wanted. Of course, is it a surprise that Asian people became systematically obsessed with doing good on exams? It's like they were literally indoctrinated to believe that being good at exams is probably the best talent you could have in the entire world out of all the talents out there. This focus has definitely weakened in the modern world, like from the sole fact that of course the imperial examination system just doesn't exist anymore. But I think it still remains a very strong cultural thing that in Asia, kids with better grades are just seen as better kids. And this is reinforced from all areas, from parents to teachers to their peers. And I guess sometimes parents just have this sort of vanity that they want their kids to do good at school, because this sort of praise and respect kind of gets reflected back onto them as parents who raised, high excelling kids. So as we mentioned, the socio-economic reality of Asia has changed greatly. Like, we don't have this examination system anymore, even though even now in a lot of Asian countries, you still need to take some sort of governmental exam to get into specific governmental posts, but it's like less predominant. And I guess, from modernization and the infiltration of other cultural influences, Asians are increasingly coming to embrace a more diverse form of what a good life is. So on top of all these, the question to be asked would be, what if Asia suddenly just, decreased its population density and opportunities are more abundant and the conception of a good life becomes more diverse? Will the Asian parent be less demanding and controlling and respect their kids' autonomy as persons more? And my answer would be not necessarily. And this is where we come to the most complex part, which is cultural reasons. So as Elliot from Quora mentioned, Confucius literally taught that children were the subordinates of parents. Confucius was a Chinese dude, but his ideas basically were largely influential throughout the entire Asia. So his teachings is probably like the source of why parents felt entitled to do whatever they want to their children. And they also feel entitled to demand anything from their children. So take Chinese culture, for example, we have this concept called 孝道, which literally does not have an English translation, and that is just a great testament to cultural differences. So it's basically a moral value under the Confucius moral system, and it is actually labeled explicitly as the most important moral value to uphold. What does this idea consist of? Well, it roughly dictates how children should treat their parents. So there is no specific set of, Bible-like life commandments, but generally everyone kind of has an idea of what it consists of. So the general idea is a form of giving back to your parents because you have to be infinitely grateful to them for having given you life. And it sort of entails satisfying whatever wishes your parents have and always putting their demands and well-being and happiness ahead of your own. And of course, you need to prioritize the satisfaction of 孝道 ahead of every other moral good. So Asians in general are just brought up in an environment that places so much emphasis on this value. It's gotten to such a level that people have become sort of accustomed to evaluating someone's moral character based on whether they obey this value or not. Like, this is probably the biggest moral criterion that would be held up to someone. It's like, if you don't pass this, then no matter how good you do in all the other areas, you're still seen as less of a person. Secondly, as a generalization, I think Asian cultures are strongly hierarchical, so much more than cultures, in all other areas of the world, as seen by the fact that it's just considered very impolite to call people who are of a higher social status or age than you by their first name or their full name. You would usually use their last name with a suffix that either gestures to their seniority or gestures to their position in a certain aspect of society. And when I say Asian cultures are hierarchical, I think the hierarchical idea is very different from how Western people tend to conceive of social hierarchies, which is most strongly in terms of class. In Asia, I think hierarchies tend to exist in a variety of spheres of life, or like mini hierarchies in different contexts. These hierarchies, rather than based on class, are more likely to be based on seniority. So for example, whether it's at school, you call someone older than you your senpai, like in Japanese culture, or in the workplace or in the family, you're expected to display a lot of respect for people who are older than you. Now, so here's my theory regarding why this hierarchy still exists so strongly today. The key premise we need to keep in mind is that most Western countries have a very individualistic cultural value system, but Asian cultures tend to be much more communitarian. And no, this is not the same as communism. They're two completely unrelated ideas. And communitarianism is basically a philosophy that emphasizes the connection between the individual and the community. Its overriding philosophy is based upon the belief that a person's social identity and personality are largely molded by community relationships, with a small degree of development being placed on individualism. So as much as I found that movie, like a few years ago, that hit movie, you know what I'm going to say? Crazy Rich Asians. As much as I found it was so cliche, it was literally like a mashed-up pot of every single Asian cliche that you will ever know as an Asian. But as much as I found that cliche, I believe that it depicted the communitarian spirit in Asia very, very well. The key idea is that you are literally nobody singled out as an individual. So for example, in Western countries, we typically take the interests of individuals as the unit of value that we need to measure when we try to say we're making people better off. But in Asia, units of value are the family, the clan, or some specific community. So because people in general prioritize the well-being of the collective over the individual, then it's always so much more important that the collective remains stable and flourishing, and this is the reason why they insist so much on strict hierarchies. This is so that the individuals are put in their place and they do not disrupt the collective. Yes, it means that the cost would often be that individuals are oppressed, their voices are not heard, they're disrespected. But if it's good for the collective, then these problems are considered tolerable. So back to the parenting problem. If parents and even perhaps grandparents take the family as the unit of value, then they naturally feel justified to control and subjugate their children and grandchildren in various ways, because this is done to maintain the stability and the interest of the family overall. It's not that they don't love their children, but they simply think it's like the natural way of how things are. So I guess they think about it in a sense akin to you should sacrifice your personal interest for the good of your country, because the wider collective is just more valuable. However, I definitely am seeing a shift in the parenting style of later generations, and it's only really natural and expected as people become more exposed to the idea of individualism, and especially the idea that even when kids are kids, they have some sort of rights and basic dignities that should be respected. And, parents of later generations, they typically do not feel like they have the license to do whatever they want to their kids as the older generations usually felt. Here is all I want to say about the Asian parent phenomenon. Please leave any of your thoughts on this topic, or if you're Asian, your personal experience of this phenomenon. I would really love to read about other people's thoughts and experiences in the comments. So if you liked my video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.